To anyone versed in the epic fanboy flame wars of the 7th console generation, it takes only 2 names to send a shudder down their spine. 2 abysmal abominations released in an era where Sony was in desperate need of killer apps to justify the steep asking price of the PlayStation 3. 2 games that upon release gave Xbox 360 fanboys ammunition against their PS3 fanboy foes for years to come thanks to the abysmal scores these overhyped would-be killer apps received. Those 2 games in question are Lair and Haze, 2 games that quite frankly, despite both being very flawed games, were a lot better than the review scores made them out to be, at least in my opinion. Like Haze, Lair received a lot of pre-release hype. Again, both Sony and PS3 owners were hungry for great games to play, and forum fanboys needed ammunition to fling at their Gears of War playing and Halo 3 playing opponents. Lair hit before Halo 3, and despite the epic hype and huge anticipation by fans, came out to horrible review scores thanks to the poor design idea, either forced by Sony or chosen entirely by Factor 5 depending on who you ask, to make the game motion control only without the option to use the analog stick for flight and aiming controls. IGN gave this game a 4.9 out of 10 in a poorly written review, where upon reading it, the only conclusion I could come to is that in full Dean Takahashi fashion, it sounds like the reviewer, Greg Miller, wrote his entire review after he couldn't beat the 5th level of the game. The review literally only mentions that level and none of the later much harder levels. He complains about the targeting system in the game, which I agree with, and then touched on the story a bit while complaining about the controls the whole time. I guess he gave the game 1 point for every level he was actually able to beat. IGN wasn't alone in destroying this game. Most magazine publications and websites completely panned the game, with a few average to good scores thrown in there. The forced motion control scheme was too much for most gamers and reviewers at the time. When Factor 5 later released a patch to allow players to use the analog sticks to aim, the damage was already done, and Lair had already become an infamous bad game in the gaming zeitgeist of the day. The analog patch is still available on the PS3's PlayStation Store, and if you have any interest in ever playing Lair, I suggest you download it as soon as possible, because we all know time is ticking before Sony shuts down the PS3's PlayStation Store. I also suggest getting the Titan map pack for Unreal Tournament 3 if you ever want to take advantage of Unreal Tournament 3's mod support, which is the coolest yet still nearly forgotten feature on the PS3. I guess the reason I decided to review Lair first on this channel was to remind people that time is of the essence when it comes to getting the map packs and patches for PS3 games that you want to play. It's time to start downloading as many of these as you can before they are gone. For my first playthrough of Lair, I decided to play the entire game through using only the original motion control setup, just to see what the original experience was like. After that, I went back and played random levels with the analog stick aiming enabled, and the analog aiming patch definitely improves the gameplay a lot. Without question, it was a huge mistake on Sony and Factor 5's fault not to include it day one. Lair had a rough development cycle. At first, there were a lot of good ideas that Factor 5 was planning to add to the game, and the game wasn't even going to resemble the final product we got. Long story short, in order to get something in a shippable form, they hunkered down and went with a trustworthy formula that had worked for them in the past. When it comes down to it, Lair is basically Rogue Leader with dragons. Learning the motion controls didn't take long, and the only time they became frustrating to use was in those bouts of slowdown that affected the aiming. The game in general doesn't run the best when played in 1080p mode. The slowdown doesn't affect the aiming all the time, but there were occasional periods where the aiming became almost impossible to use with the motion controls thanks to the frame rate dipping. Lair was meant to be a visual spectacle for the PS3, and as such the developers prioritized graphical fidelity over playability. I did manage to play through the entire game in 1080p, and most of this footage is in 1080p because I was focused on trying to make the game look as good as possible for this video. However, it does run a little better in 720p, which is what I suggest those looking for a more playable experience to play it at. In order to run the game in 720p, you have to go into your system settings and turn off 1080p and 1080i as options, as there is no option in the game to change it. That's just kind of how the PS3 worked. Oftentimes you'd have to shut off 720p in order to get it to display 1080p, whereas the Xbox 360 was a lot more user-friendly in this regard. Once I learned the controls, I actually started to really enjoy my time with Lair. It really does follow a solid formula established in the Rogue Squadron / Rogue Leader series. The missions are objective heavy and some have very strict time limits leading to constant failures, but also that made me want to give a failed mission just one more try. Some of the later missions in particular feel twice as long as they should be, and dying or failing right before the end of these missions can demotivate you from wanting to give it another try. I definitely shut this game off a couple of times after nearly beating the Dead Man's Basin level, only to die or fail at the end, but I did find myself coming back within an hour or so to give it another try, finally beating it with a huge, satisfying sigh of relief and a pretty good shoulder workout from shaking the controller up and down as fast as I possibly could. But as in Rogue Leader, I did get better at playing each level as time went on, learning the patterns and seeing which objectives were more important to do first. The game will constantly pull you out of the action to show you a cutscene of a new objective or to show you how you are failing at the objectives. While I can understand this is done to add to the cinematic flair of the game, what it really amounts to is the feeling that every couple of seconds you're pulled out of the gameplay, and when you return to controlling your dragon, you have to quickly regain your bearings. This can be especially annoying if you're in the middle of lining up a shot at an enemy outpost that's destroying your ships, losing too many of which will lead to a mission over. Oftentimes, the interruptions led me to overshooting an enemy outpost and having to turn around while feeling excessive time pressure. The cinematic nature of the game can sometimes break the flow of the gameplay. I was also a little let down by the fact that most of the missions in the game were escort and protect type missions, and there wasn't much for straight up dogfighting in the game. Well, dragon fighting. Escort missions are some of my least favorite and some of the most frustrating mission types in any game. They even threw in a stealth mission for good measure, and even a strange story mission where you have to hunt for water and then fight a giant bug to get to it. However, I was yearning for more dogfight style missions and more missions that made use of transferring to the ground to take out hordes of enemy soldiers. The ground fighting feature is a really fun mechanic that I wish they had expanded on. It's a cool idea and it's fun to land and kill hundreds of enemy peons. Eventually, new combos can be unlocked to unleash on the enemy hordes based on the medal system in the game, where you get graded by how you do in each level, similar to how they did it in Rogue Squadron. The dragon disarms are also pretty cool to see. When engaged, players are prompted into a quick time event to kill the enemy dragon and its rider. These are mildly entertaining and do add that cinematic flair the game is going for. You can disarm the enemy dragons, or you can fight them in a fighting game minigame which has almost a rock paper scissors feel to it. There are some ideas at play that seem cool on paper and are mildly entertaining the first time, but probably should have been trimmed out of the game because they disrupt the gameplay flow. An example of this is how your dragon can pick up and fling an enemy foot soldier as the game pauses to watch the poor soul ragdolling across the map. The first time it's amusing, but after a while it becomes yet another thing to interrupt the game. The ability to pick up enemy foot soldiers also interrupts the targeting system, and as the IGN reviewer complained about, becomes a source of frustration when instead of targeting a mission objective, like a large rhino, your dragon swoops down to pick up a foot soldier instead, and the camera takes a disorienting position that makes it hard to even realize what just happened. Even after mastering the motion controls or playing with the analog sticks, the game has a few technical issues that aren't game-breaking by any means, but had they been ironed out would have improved the experience quite a bit more. The frame rate is an obvious issue, as is the targeting system, which when you get it to work properly can lead to some thrilling circling while firing on enemies. I wish they would have had time to rework the whole targeting system to a more workable form, where the camera cooperates better. There are plenty examples in prior games that got this function right for some truly excellent results. There are times in this game where you feel like you are fighting with the targeting system to get it to work just right. A little bit of extra tweaking in this area would have gone a long way. The camera can also freak out and be very disorienting at times, but not always. Generally it follows the action well, but it can be very wonky at other times. The physics system in the game also has its own peculiarity to it, where if your dragon comes too close to an object or an enemy dragon flies too close to your dragon, dragon, it bounces your dragon up and out of the way from it. It's almost like there is a physics force field around the objects in the game that can bounce your aim away in the other direction. This can be very frustrating when you're trying to aim at a specific target and your aim is shot upwards in a completely different direction because an enemy flew too close to you. This can also lead to some jank when you are locked onto something like a war beast and your dragon is stuck flying around the sides of a ridge and can't seem to just fly up and over it. There are times where I was trying with all my might while being locked on to turn left while my dragon being stuck following the side of a ridge is going right instead. The glitchy physics can also knock you out of a dragon duel because you ran into a wall, so the game cancelled it out, throwing you back into the game without notice. Another thing that at first seemed janky to me until I realized it was done on purpose but is never explained to you is in those scenes where your dragon has to latch onto something like, say, a generator and you have to shake your controller rapidly up and down in order to destroy it. Getting shot by an enemy will knock you off the object you are attached to. At first I thought the game would just inconsistently let go of the object, when in actuality I was taking shots by surrounding foes. I have also, though I didn't get any footage of it, thrown foot soldiers through the map into the abyss that exists outside the game world. And all of that being said, despite quite a list of technical issues and glitches, I still really enjoyed my time in Lair overall. I wasn't a fan of the overwhelming amount of escort missions, but the more I played them, the better I got at them. It has that same difficulty curve as Rogue Leader, which is still one of my favorite Gamecube games. The game can be tough and yet still very satisfying when you succeed, and not even the escort missions and sometimes unfair time limits kept me from enjoying the game, despite its flaws. As I stated, the formula in Lair is based on a sound one, and if you are a fan of Factor 5 Star Wars games, then you will probably find some enjoyment in Lair. It's definitely a more flawed version of the formula when compared to what came before, but I still found the game to be engaging enough to play all the way through it. It pulled me into its gameplay, and I enjoyed myself overall. The game is not without its share of frustrations and flaws. If you can get past the controls, or just download the analog aiming patch from PSN, and get past the glitches, you might find some enjoyment out of this infamous quote-unquote bad game. It is a shame that the game did so poorly in the reviews thanks mostly to the controls. It's also a shame that some of the technical issues weren't ironed out before release. But Factor 5 definitely put a lot of effort into this game, and however imperfect it is, this isn't a bad game. Out of the two terrible twins of the early PS3 games, I would say that Lair is definitely better than Haze, even if I don't think Haze is that bad either. It was another game that had a lot of good ideas that just never quite came together before release. Free Radical should have also trimmed a lot of those good ideas on paper out and polished the gameplay more, cutting down on the large but empty feeling levels and getting the gunplay and AI better. Haze still has some fun bot deathmatches though, and the online was actually decent back in the day. I still like Haze even though it's horribly flawed, but maybe that's just because I've determined to like it. Graphically, Lair definitely nailed the epic scale and scope they were aiming for in the game. The only thing they didn't nail was the frame rate. Aiming for 1080p was a bit much for the PS3, but in early games, developers certainly didn't know the console's limits. It does play a little smoother at lower resolutions. The art direction is unique and the graphics were excellent for a first generation PS3 game. They also put a lot of effort into the story cutscenes. The story itself is pretty good, if predictable. No complaints with the voice acting either. If you're a story-based gamer as opposed to being a gameplay-based gamer like myself, there is something here for you as well. The orchestral musical score is amazing and fits the epic feel of the game perfectly. You can tell they spared no expense when it came to the game's soundtrack. The sound effects from the cries of enemy soldiers to the snarls of your dragon are also well done. There was a lot of care and effort put into the sound design of this game, and it shines through. The bottom line. Lair is definitely a flawed game that hit with a polarizing control scheme and various other technical glitches. However, this game is definitely a lot better than the reviews made it out to be. I don't give review scores, but this is a 7 out of 10 kind of game, give or take a point or half a point. The hype for the game was huge before it hit, filling a void in time where Sony desperately needed more killer apps for the PS3 to justify the system's price, and to convince more people to buy the system, which made its low review scores even more more embarrassing for Sony at a time where they couldn't even buy good press if they wanted to. Well, they probably could have, but Microsoft could buy more negative press. Simply put, Lair was never going to be a killer app. Even if it released day one with analog stick control and all the technical glitches had been ironed out before release. Gaming had changed, and the days where a game like Rogue Leader could come in and be a killer app for the Gamecube were long past. In just a few short years since the Gamecube hit, mainstream tastes had changed, and the dawn of the online and digital era was upon us. Games had also jumped up from a $50 asking price to a $60 asking price, and we thought the future of strictly single-player games was in question at that time. Outside of something like Grand Theft Auto or Oblivion, that is, Lair could be beaten in just a couple of hours, and its only online connectivity was leaderboards, which are still up to this day. People wanted Gears of War, Halo 3, and eventually Modern Warfare. Most traditional single-player games were all but ignored by the vast majority of gamers in the PS3 era. First-person shooters, predominantly modern shooters, and duck-and-cover third-person shooters with a heavy emphasis on online play dominated the generation, and unless it was a big-name franchise, most other traditional genres were put aside by gamers and developers. Whole genres and subgenres of games more or less died, even if they were a popular genre on the PS2 from the previous generation. I mean, even 3D platformers, which were immensely popular on the PS2, GameCube, and Xbox, are only just now starting to recover from the 7th generation, where we were pretty much just down to Ratchet & Clank and Mario. 3D space or airplane flight games pretty much died outside of maybe Ace Combat and Tom Clancy's Hawks. Even once big-name games like Unreal Tournament 3 failed to do well enough to keep midway games from going out of business. Development costs at the time skyrocketed, and developers had to go with whatever popular tastes were at the time just to survive. Tons of great traditional style single-player games were ignored by the mainstream gamers, outside of maybe for weekend rentals. And Lair, being a single-player game with a single-player focus, even had it released in perfect form, wasn't going to sell systems. Not even better games that hit like Uncharted and Heavenly Sword, which came out later, were console sellers. Now, Grand Theft Auto 4 and Metal Gear Solid 4 were console selling games with a predominantly single-player focus, but those were uber popular franchises. Lair, for those who can look past its flaws, is still worth playing. It definitely plays a lot better with the analog stick, so again, make sure if you have any interest in playing this game or replaying this game to get your PS3 online to the PlayStation Store and download the patch while it's still available, and the Titan Map Pack for Unreal Tournament 3 while you're at it. Even if you don't own the games, you can download the pack, and if you ever get the game, you can install it. This game is far from a 4 or 5 out of 10 kind of game. Looking back on what we know now, I actually truly doubt most of the reviewers ever beat the game before they even reviewed it. At its lowest, Lair is a 6, because it's still playable. It's really not that bad of a game, and it certainly wasn't worthy to be used as cannon fodder in online arguments. Haze, however, I can understand. But if Lair is the worst game you've ever played, you should probably play some more games.